So good to see you. I'm sitting here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. I am shaking up the unnamed orange beverage. It has a nice unnamed orange cap up on it, and I'm pouring it into my unnamed cup of ice, and we are going to have a great evening. Welcome, everybody. So glad we can have a chat here tonight. Welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad that you're here. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. Be sure to hit that notifications bell. Be sure that you're subscribed, because sometimes the algorithms unsubscribe people. It's a thing about YouTube's algorithms. Be sure to post this on your Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Bunker Chan, Prol Wiki, wherever videos are posted. Post this stream. The more people that are here, the more fun that we have. So I'm so glad you all are here. So glad you all are here. The way it works is I give my opening remarks, and then from there, I do the roll call. Call you out as I see you, names and locations. We find out who it is who's watching these streams. And then from there, we do me answering your super chats for the rest of the night. The super chats determine how long the rest of the show goes. So that's how it works. I'll be writing down your super chats with my clicking pen. And then in the second half of the show, I will answer your super chats with my voice. And there we go. So that's how it's going to work. So keep the super chats rolling in. I'll be writing them down, and then I will answer them in the second half of the show. Welcome, everybody. Hit the like button, hit the notifications bell, hit the subscribe button. And now I'll jump right into my opening remarks. Someone in the chat called it Afghanistan. Afghanistan. Let me write down these super chats. Physical editions of Lenin's works. Works. All right. Let's get Americans to support Fusion City. All righty. Very, very, very good. Very, very, very good. So, Afghanistan. Those of you who may not be aware of current events, the United States today announced that it was sending 3,000 military forces, mostly U.S. Marines, to Afghanistan for the purpose of escorting out the U.S. personnel who are currently in the country. It is urging all U.S. personnel currently in Afghanistan to get the hell out of there. In fact, there's going to be some U.S. soldiers there to make sure that nobody kills them as they get the hell out of there. And the USA is leaving Afghanistan. The Taliban seized several provinces in a single day. They're inching closer to the capital city of Kabul. And it looks like the USA is going to keep its deadline and be out by September 11th. And that seems to be the situation. Very interesting, isn't it? Very, very interesting. Now, where do we begin? Where do we begin to understand what's going on here? Because I can tell you already, the U.S. media is already playing up the idea that the Taliban is retaking areas and committing atrocities. And oh, look, this is what happens when the U.S. leaves, when we don't occupy places. People commit horrendous human rights violations. They're already doing that. Biden is playing up the idea the USA is withdrawing, and public opinion in the United States is overwhelmingly in favor of leaving Afghanistan. 73%, a whopping 73% of the US public says, get out. Get out of there. So the USA is withdrawing forces from Afghanistan. So where do we begin? Now, do we begin 18 years ago when the USA invaded Afghanistan supposedly to get Osama bin Laden? The USA invaded Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban government, set up military forces. Is that where we start? The NATO U.S. invasion of Afghanistan that was supposed to bring democracy to Afghanistan instead brought poppy fields. It vastly expanded the global heroin trade. It opened up for all kinds of warlords and chaos and ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Created a safe space for the Jindallah terrorists to go over the border and attack Iran. Created a safe space for Wahhabi Islamic separatist forces to go over the border into China. Created a space for all kinds of networks of Wahhabi extremists and fanatics to operate in Central Asia and harass Russia and harass Central Asian countries that are aligned with Russia. Ceausescu corrupt. Is that where we should begin? The 18 years of instability? The 18 years the United States has been in Afghanistan, 19 years. Things haven't gotten better. Conditions in the country for women have actually gotten worse. While on paper they may have more rights, they're far more in danger of being violently attacked and killed on the street. Instability in the country, fear, hunger, malnutrition. Nothing got better in Afghanistan as a result of the U.S. military occupation. If the U.S. military occupation was supposed to improve the life of the people of Afghanistan, then it clearly didn't do what it was supposed to do. And Osama bin Laden was not captured in Afghanistan. And the Taliban were not involved in 9/11. And everything we were told about Afghanistan to justify the intervention seems to have not worked out. Women are not more free. They're not. The Taliban were not involved in the 9/11 attacks. The people haven't been liberated from a brutal dictatorship. In fact, things have gotten far worse in the country. Instability, chaos. The heroin trade flourished. So we can talk about 18 years of instability, 18 years of chaos in Afghanistan. And now it seems like, geez, Dugan. It seems like the Taliban is making a major offensive, seizing provinces. The USA is getting out of there. So what's going on? What's going on? Why is this happening? What is going on in Afghanistan? And we can go back a little bit further. And we can talk about the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. That was the government that ruled Afghanistan from 1978 until 1993. That was a Marxist-Leninist government led by the People's Democratic Party. And that government was teaching women to read. It was reforesting the country, industrializing. how the People's Democratic Party battled against an insurgency backed by the United States that included Osama bin Laden and al-Zarqawi, how international media portrayed the terrorists aligned with Saudi Arabia, the folks who eventually called themselves al-Qaeda, directed by Saudis, the global army of Wahhabi extremists who convened on Afghanistan to wage a quote-unquote holy war against the People's Democratic Party, how the Soviet Union sent its military to back up the People's Democratic Party, how this war was waged in Afghanistan, and how one of the ways the United States enabled the holy war against the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, one of the ways the USA backed and supported the holy war, the so-called holy war against the Afghan government, was to work with the Pakistani secret police to enable Osama bin Laden and his buddies to get in on the heroin business and, set up poppy fields and smuggle their heroin over the border into Pakistan and then onto the international markets, and how Afghanistan became a hub in the heroin trade. And then, after the Soviet Union fell, the People's Democratic Republic, it held out for a few more years. It kept going. Finally, it was defeated. And when the People's Democratic Republic was defeated, at that point, the Taliban set up shop. And the Taliban was pretty awful, was pretty repressive of music and pretty repressive of women and very, very backward. And one thing that the Taliban did do, though, is they got rid of the heroin trade. They were very, very anti-heroin. In fact, the UN gave the Taliban an award for how effective their war on drugs was. If there's, if maybe they ought to run our war on drugs here in the United States. Whatever the Taliban was doing seemed to work. But the Taliban, I'm joking, of course, I'm not serious, but they apparently waged a very effective war, right? A very effective war toward kulaks. They apparently waged a very effective war on drugs, and the UN recognized them for doing that. Very effective war on drugs. Naddle fed. And then the Taliban apparently was negotiating some kind of oil pipeline, and I remember it seemed pretty random. It was before 9/11. Suddenly in U.S. media, we started hearing negative reports about the Taliban. Before 9/11, I remember they talked about how the Taliban were destroying ancient Buddhist statues because they were not Islamic. And there was a lot in U.S. media about how this crazy Taliban government is destroying these ancient Buddhist statues. Stoicism in Rome. Impact Today. We also heard about the persecution of Hindus in Afghanistan and how the Taliban was persecuting Hindus. And NPR, my parents listened to NPR. I was a young teen at the time of this, and I remember this is before the 9/11 attacks. This is before any of that. U.S. media started telling us the Taliban were no good. They were no good. That Taliban, they were no good. I remember that. We heard about them blowing up statues. We heard about them persecuting Hindus. And suddenly the U.S. government, U.S. media decided Taliban no good. 9/11 happened, and somehow we were convinced that Osama bin Laden, despite being a wealthy Saudi, was somehow part of the Taliban. And the Taliban said they would turn him over, I remember, but they wanted to put him through their own courts. They said that wasn't good enough. Jesse Jackson tried to be the hero, and Jesse Jackson was convinced that he would get the Taliban to turn over bin Laden, but he wasn't able to because that wasn't whatever. The Taliban, they weren't turning him over fast enough, and so the USA invaded Afghanistan. And there was something called the Northern Alliance, which was forces in Afghanistan that rejected the Taliban. And then there was the Taliban. And the Northern Alliance was forces that had been part of the Mujahideen, the religious mobilization against the Soviets, but they were not Taliban aligned. The Taliban was like a faction among the anti-Soviet fighting forces. We can go back even further than that. Let's go back even further than that when we're talking about Afghanistan. That's how did the whole thing start with the Soviet Union and Afghanistan? How did that whole thing start? How did the People's Democratic Party come to power? Well, we now know Zbigniew Brzezinski, the head of the Center of Anti-Communist Studies at Columbia University, the advisor to Jimmy Carter, the advisor to many presidents, the winner of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the geopolitical strategist, the Polish-American geopolitical strategist whose daughter is Mika Brzezinski on Morning Joe. Zbigniew Brzezinski admits that he set up the Afghan Trap, where they arranged for the Soviet Union to have to send its forces to Afghanistan. The Afghan Trap, right? Russian Revolution, not real proletarian. The Afghan Trap is the term that was used. Brzezinski forced the monarchy, right? There was a monarchy in Afghanistan, and that monarchy was neutral. The Soviet Union was right on their border. They were not a Soviet-aligned country. The USA was friendly with them. They were not a US-aligned country. They were a neutral monarchy. A neutral monarchy. And what happened? Well, the Soviet Union, trying to make friends with its neighbors, gave a lot of military training to the military of Afghanistan. And in the process, there were a lot of military guys in the Afghan military who became somewhat sympathetic to the Soviet government. And they formed the People's Democratic Party. And a lot of higher-ups in the Afghan military were communists, were Marxist-Leninists, were people who'd gotten military training in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had sold them a lot of weapons and taken them to the Soviet Union to learn military strategy and all of that. And there were a lot of guys in Afghanistan who were impressed with the Soviet Union, won over to Marxism-Leninism, El Salvador, won over to Marxism-Leninism, FMLN, won over to Marxism-Leninism. Whoa. Where? Anti-degrowth. All right. Won over to Marxism-Leninism. Capitalism. Answer. They were won over to Marxism-Leninism, but they knew that the population of Afghanistan was largely deeply religious, was largely based in the rural areas, was largely conservative, and they also knew that Afghanistan was deeply underdeveloped, that most of the country still had some version of feudalism, right? They still had a monarchy, they still had landlords and peasants, and the idea of building socialism in Afghanistan would be extremely difficult. So even though a lot of these military guys were communists, they were not ready. They knew that a revolution in Afghanistan was not really realistic. CIA-US connection. They realized that. So what happened was the USA put a huge amount of pressure on the monarchy of Afghanistan to start politically repressing the military. The people in the military were sympathetic to the Soviet Union, were being rounded up and put into prison. And so, in order to avoid being persecuted, the military was forced to overthrow the government. And it was kind of a heroic revolution. They tore down the walls of the jail and freed their comrades and stormed the palace and declared that the People's Democratic Party was basically forced to take power in Kabul. They didn't want to take power, but they were forced into a situation where they had to take power. And we now know that the USA engineered that. It was called the Afghan Trap. That was Zbigniew Brzezinski. He brags about it. He said he gave the Soviet Union their Vietnam. John Brown. But you can go back even further than that. Why stop there? Right? I've just been taking you further back and further back. Why stop there? Let's go back to 1921. After the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union is very new. Lenin calls a conference in Baku, in Azerbaijan, the Baku Conference. It's called the Conference of the Peoples of the East. And who comes to that conference? None other than the Emir of Afghanistan. The Emir of Afghanistan. He's the king of Afghanistan, the leader, the Emir of Afghanistan. A lot of Bolsheviks, a lot of Russian folks, and a lot of people see this guy walk in, this Emir of Afghanistan. And they aren't too happy about that, because the Emir of Afghanistan is not a liberal. The Emir of Afghanistan is not an enlightened progressive by any means. He is a very, very autocratic, authoritarian leader. He is very, very, very religious. He is very, very, very conservative. But Lenin welcomes the Emir of Afghanistan to the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku in Azerbaijan. And later, Lenin has a meeting, a face-to-face meeting with the Emir of Afghanistan. And he says that he supports the Emir of Afghanistan. And many people around the world in the global Marxist movement say, how in the world can Vladimir Lenin support the Emir of Afghanistan? How in the world can anyone support the Emir of Afghanistan? And Lenin responds, because he's against the British Empire. He's against the imperialists. And anybody who is against the imperialists gets the support of the Soviet Union. Let me repeat that. Anybody who is against the imperialists gets the support of the Soviet Union. And how did the Emir of Afghanistan come into power? Because the British Empire had occupied Afghanistan. And the British had been there. And the people of Afghanistan did not like what the British were doing. One of the things the British Empire did is it deforested Afghanistan. Afghanistan used to have a lot more forests than it does now, but the British discovered that in Afghanistan they have some very rare wood that is very, very valuable. And so the British started cutting down all the trees and importing this very rare, high-quality wood back to Britain. Well, the people of Afghanistan did not particularly like the British, so they rallied around a monarchy, a traditional conservative monarchy. They rallied around it, and they drove out the British Empire. And when the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, they said, we're not for monarchies, we're not for feudalism, but you're fighting the imperialists, so you're okay by us. I just gave you an overview. We went backwards through the history of Afghanistan, through 18, 19 years of U.S. occupation, through the rise of the Taliban, go further back to this Afghan war, go further back to the 1978 Sour Revolution. We went all the way back to Lenin befriending the Emir of Afghanistan, further back to how the Emir of Afghanistan came into power, fighting the British in the 1800s. I just gave you an overview of Afghan history. Because now we're about to witness some events in U.S. media. And U.S. media always manages to manipulate and distort the image of things in order to serve the rich and powerful. You may not have noticed this, but U.S. media has turned into, especially since the election of Biden, but under Trump especially as well, U.S. media has turned into the war lobby. I may have mentioned this earlier, but 73% of the U.S. public wants the USA to get out of Afghanistan. 73%. However, if you turn on American TV, there is nothing but a constant questioning of Biden's decision. He's abandoning the Afghan people. He's abandoning the Afghan women. Oh my God, the Taliban are committing atrocities. Joe Biden's just going to pull out of there and let them do it. Oh my God. U.S. media is way out of step with the American people. The American people are so sick of having troops in Afghanistan. They're sick of this war. They're sick of this occupation. But U.S. media is beating the drums of Joe Biden sold out the Afghan people. Oh my God. Already. I mean, he hasn't even pulled out yet. And they're already beating the drum. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. We're abandoning our allies. We're abandoning the Afghan people. They're beating this drum already. He hasn't even left yet. But keep in mind, that 18 years of U.S. presence in Afghanistan has not resulted in stability in the country. And also keep in mind that there's a lot of talk about the very, very valuable minerals. Iran joined Shanghai. There's a lot of very valuable minerals in Afghanistan, but they're not being exploited. You know, they're not sending people up into the mountains to extract those minerals. It's not happening. So if you think the USA is in Afghanistan to extract the mineral resources, you would be wrong, because the USA is not doing it. And they're not. I mean, yes, those minerals are there. There are some very valuable minerals that are used in cell phones and computer chips, and very, very valuable minerals in Afghanistan. That is true. But the USA has not extracted those minerals. There are not U.S. companies in Afghanistan extracting those minerals. So why is the USA in Afghanistan? Why? I'll tell you why the USA is in Afghanistan. I've said this for years. I said this a while back. You can look up an article I wrote, Why is the USA in Afghanistan? Wrote it for New Eastern Outlook magazine from the Russian Academy of Sciences. Look at a map. The USA is in Afghanistan, keeping it unstable, keeping it full of poppy fields, keeping it full of terrorist groups and drug gangs. Look at a map. The more unstable Afghanistan is, the more its neighbor Iran has a problem. The more its neighbor China has a problem. The more its neighbors in Central Asia have a problem. The more Russia has a problem. If you look at a map, and you look at the Eurasian world island, the big landmass we call Eurasia. It goes all the way from France and Germany all the way over to Shanghai and Korea. This huge stretch, this huge landmass called Eurasia. You read about how the Nazis, why did the Nazis invade Russia? Why did they do it? Right? You know, Hitler was obsessed with Napoleon. Hitler's hero was Napoleon. And Napoleon's downfall was invading Russia. So why was Hitler so stupid as to make that mistake? Well, read the Nazi writings. They said, who controls the heartland controls the world. They called it the heartland. Right? And they talked about how control of that big chunk of the map that nobody ever talks about. Those countries that we don't even know about. We just forget about them. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, right? That big chunk of the map they call Siberia, Mongolia, right? That big sections of China that we don't talk about. We generally talk about Beijing and Shanghai. Well, there's big chunks of China we don't talk about. The Uyghur regions, Tibet. Eurasia. Eurasia is a very, 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 very vital landmass. And politics and geopolitics in Eurasia is very different than geopolitics in Latin America, in the United States, in Western Europe. Okay, poppy fields, fuel, opioid, epidemic. It's very different because most of the countries in Eurasia, well, I mean, I shouldn't say most of the countries, but most of the areas in Eurasia are landlocked. Afghanistan doesn't have ocean access. It does not have ocean access. Afghanistan doesn't have, it's a landlocked country. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. These countries are pretty landlocked. They don't have access to ocean. Brzezinski, the guy who came up with the depression rates in socialist countries, the guy who came up with the Afghan Trap, right? It's a big new Brzezinski. He wrote a book in the 1990s called The Grand Chessboard, and he referred to Eurasia, the Eurasian world island, the great landmass of Eurasia. He referred to it as the Grand Chessboard. And in that book, he has the infamous quote about the way to control Eurasia is to, quote, keep the barbarians killing each other. The way to dominate Eurasia, according to one of the top geopolitical strategists in U.S. history, is to, quote, keep the barbarians killing each other. Afghan Shia breakaway state. Keep the barbarians killing each other. Foment unrest among ethnic groups. Fracture it. If you want to keep Eurasia down, fracture it. Break it into a million pieces. You want to go watch an old Soviet movie. You want to go watch one of the greatest movies in history. Go watch Sergei Eisenstein's movie, Ivan the Terrible. It's a movie about a czar who united all of Russia. He united all of Russia. The first czar to unite all of Russia was Ivan the Terrible. Go watch that movie. It's a classic movie. They made it during World War II. It was made by a communist film director. Stalin commissioned it and had the idea to make the movie. He went to Sergei Eisenstein, the father of the montage, one of the greatest filmmakers in history, and said to Sergei Eisenstein, go make a movie called Ivan the Terrible. And so they did it, and they made this movie. Ivan the Terrible. And it's about this young czar, and he's young, and he has long hair, and he's very innocent, and he's a nice guy, but he has to be ruthless. He has to be strong in order to unify all of Russia. And he has to fight the Muslims, and he has to fight the Tatars, and he has to fight this ethnic group, and he has to fight that local warlord and all of that. And with his strength, he's able to unify all of Russia. And it's hard for him to be so strong, but the church is on his side, and the peasants are on his side, and everybody wants Russia to be unified. And he's remembered as a great national hero in the history of the country. Why? Because he unified all of Russia. Now, how does that sound good, right? He built an empire that was so big? No! By getting all these vast territories, Siberia and Moldova, and getting all these vast territories into one empire, they were all able to economically advance. When they weren't fighting with each other, when they weren't divided into a bunch of little tiny principalities, by unifying, they could create things like educational systems and railways eventually. I mean, that's many hundreds of years later. But economic development in Eurasia generally comes when big, vast spaces become politically unified. In China, there is a huge amount of admiration for the Qing dynasty. Why? Because they are the dynasty that unified all of China. They got all of China together. The Qing dynasty. They were pretty ruthless, pretty authoritarian folks, but by getting all of China together, that was good for all of China. And why is the Chinese Communist Party so fired up? And why is the Chinese population so fired up about Taiwan being part of China, about Tibet being part of China, about the Uyghur regions being part of China, about Hong Kong being part of China? Why is that so gosh darn important to the people in China? Because the way the British and the Americans and the Germans and the French were able to dominate China was by dividing it, because China had no strong central government. Right? Edgar Snow talks about he went to China in the 1920s and there was mass starvation, millions of people dying. And why were they dying? There was no central government that could organize relief. Fields that were supposed to be growing food were growing poppies for the British opium trade. It was mass starvation. And of course, they make a big deal out of the Great Leap Forward. We constantly hear about the Great Leap Forward in China. Well, that was awful. The Great Leap Forward was awful. But there was a Great Leap Forward every year, practically, before the revolution. Tens of millions of people died in China over and over and over again when the British dominated China, when Western capitalism and free trade, they didn't have a strong central government. I mean, it was, the amount of famines and mass starvation and deaths that happened before 1949 on a routine basis in China, before the rise of the Communist Party. And we forget it. But the Communist Party, yes, there was a famine during the Great Leap Forward period, early 1960s. They had a horrendous famine. But it was the Chinese Communist Party that mechanized agriculture. It was the Chinese Communist Party that created the modern food system, so this never happens again. It's the Chinese Communist Party that brought in industry. The Chinese Communist Party cured China of centuries of malnutrition, modernized China, made it now the second largest economy in the world. And part of the pride that they take is that they created one China, that the Qing dynasty had made one China, and then the British Empire had torn China apart with the Opium Wars and the French concessions, and there were German territories, and then the Chinese Communist Party took China back again for the Chinese people and reunified it. This is very important in Eurasia. If you want to have economic development on the Eurasian world island, you need to have the vast territories unified. They need to be working together. Right? I mean, they need to be working together. With the vast territories of Eurasia are working together, you can have economic development. But if you want people in Eurasia to be poor and starving, if you want them to be captive markets and clients, if you want what Zbigniew Brzezinski wants and what he writes about in his book, The Grand Chessboard, you, quote, keep the barbarians killing each other. You foment unrest. In Afghanistan, ever since the United States invaded, Afghanistan has been key in fomenting unrest throughout Eurasia. Drug gangs do not bring peace. They don't. Drug gangs don't bring peace. Ever since the USA has been in Afghanistan, there's been a huge amount. All right, Lukashenko, socialism. There's been a huge amount of instability and violence and chaos from drug gangs. Sunni separatist groups that go over the border into Iran and are trying to break Sunni regions of Iran away from the rest of the country. Not bringing peace. Right? Uyghur separatists that go over the border into China. Heroin dealers trying to smuggle heroin into China. Not bringing peace. Not bringing peace. Right? Wahhabi extremist groups that set up networks based in Afghanistan, that operate throughout Central Asia, spreading terrorism and spreading, Islamist ideology, and, have ties to Chechen groups and ISIS and stuff, not bringing peace. And the USA has been using Afghanistan as a strategic epicenter of chaos. Now, the USA is pulling out of Afghanistan. There's a plan. There's a plan. The USA has been talking to the Taliban for years. There have been meetings in Doha. The Trump administration was talking with the Taliban. Biden administration's been talking to the Taliban. The Russians have been talking to the Taliban. You can bet China and Iran have been talking to the Taliban. Taliban is the biggest political force in Afghanistan. And they're surging ahead right now. And these meetings that have happened, we're not there. We don't know what goes on in these meetings. There's been some leaks to the media. All right. DPRK. There's been some leaks to the media. We know at one point they wanted to merge the Taliban into the Afghan government. That was a proposal that was made where their military would just merge with the Afghan military. That was their proposal. There's been some leaks. We don't know what was said in those meetings. But I can tell you what I speculate is going on here. I can tell you what I suspect is happening. I wasn't there. I don't know. I'm speculating. This is mere speculation. The USA has made some kind of arrangement with the Taliban. Some kind of non-public arrangement with the Taliban. The USA has said something to the effect of, you can have Afghanistan as long as you don't start playing ball with Russia, China, and Iran. If you don't play ball with Iran, you don't play ball with Russia and China, we'll let you have Afghanistan. And I think that deal was made. Furthermore, I feel like the United States is now going to try its best, just like it did in 1978 with the Sour Revolution, the Afghan Trap. It's going to try to set the stage for Russia, China, and Iran to feel like they have to become militarily involved in Afghanistan. I feel like they're going to create a situation in Afghanistan with the use of proxy